You're listening to Real Conversations, where every week we take a peek at the favorite movies of fascinating people. Real Conversations is hosted by Bryan Coley, the founder of Art Within and Real.
Hi there, welcome back to Real Conversations, and I'm your guest host, Kim Bird, and I am turning the tables again on Bryan Coley. And if you missed our last podcast, Bryan goes into great depth on his theories about how the Oscar films can actually be used by God to sort of show us where we're going, and it's very fascinating. So if you go back and if you haven't had a chance, please listen and really take some of that in. It was kind of overwhelming and surprising to think about a movie being made years ago that actually comes all together in this one spot and shows us where we are and where we're going. So, Bryan, for most people, I think, a lot of people watch films, but they don't always follow or even know about the films in the Oscars that are nominated. So can you tell us a little bit about the Oscar films that are nominated this year for 2017?
All right. So this year's Oscar Best Picture nominees are... let's start with Arrival, which Amy Adams starred in, and it's a movie about how these aliens come down and invade America, but it's done in such an artful way.
Yes, totally
and she's a linguist, and she talks to these aliens, and creates a common language with them. And of course, it's just wonderful the way it plays with time and the way what you find out in the end also. So that's Arrival.
Good.
Yeah. Fences is Denzel Washington's big passion project, in which he plays a father, and it kind of deals with a household. It deals with his past, not being able to make the major leagues during a time in which African Americans were coming into the major leagues, and yet also having a son who he's kind of dissuading into going into sports, and just a lot of just his, I would say, using the term from the movie, his crookeds and straights, meaning the flaws of him as well as the wonderful thing about who he is. So that's Fences. And then Hell or High Water is a movie about two brothers who go and rob banks, and Jeff Bridges ends up being
the new sheriff in town.
Who's kind of going after them. And yet it has at its core this concept of home and how they're trying to save the family home. Hidden Figures, which is a nice...
Girl power!
Yeah, girl power and going back into history. So it's a true story about these African-American women who knew they were part of our history in the space race. And it's just wonderful kind of look back at that and being very inclusive to their story and how they actually were a part of putting a man in orbit. Another true story is Hacksaw Ridge, in which it's a very brutal movie showing war in the way it is in World War II. But it's really about Andrew Garfield as the main character, plays the main character who's a pacifist, but yet wants to fight for his country. He just doesn't want to have a gun in his hands. And so it's just really an intriguing story from the standpoint of how he and his battalion come together and fight. La La Land has been touted as the Oscar favorite and darling this year, and it's about two artists who meet in L.A. and are doing their craft, and yet they fall in love, and they sort of have to decide whether they're going to choose a path of love or choose a path of their ambition, and where their art is taking them, and how they support each other in that. Next movie is Manchester by the Sea, and it's a great vehicle for Casey Affleck, who's this silent, very tortured soul, you can tell, and he ends up having to go back to his birth home, which is Manchester by the Sea. And his brother has died, and he has to decide whether he's going to take guardianship over his nephew. So it's dealing a lot with home there, too. Moonlight is the coming-of-age story of this African-American boy who grows up surrounded by a lot of dysfunction and seeking home and finding it in almost like an adoptive parent or a father figure that's unexpected. And then it just follows his coming of age of being a teenage boy, and then as a man, and how he grows up, and also deals with his sexual identity in the midst of that too. And then Lion is also a coming of age story of this boy, again, who gets lost on this train in India and taken away from his family, and is totally lost, and ultimately ends up adopted as a child and growing up in Australia. Yet he has this haunting sense of, I want to go back to where I grew up in my birth home and see if my brother and my family and my mother are still alive. So really a strong slate of dramas, with La La Land being kind of the sort of fun musical in the midst of it.
So here's the thing. Now we have these nominees. What does that mean? In light of what you shared last podcast, we talked about how it kind of points to where we're going, and there's themes that are really important for us to know, and you feel like God uses them. What does this mean? What does this mean to us?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at this, even the posters of these films, you're like, how in the world do these get put together into any coherent theme? And yet, I can tell you that there's never been a more powerful theme, I think, than this year in relationship to where we are. So, we just come off this election that was very divisive. So I want to put that as the context when people think about what I'm just getting ready to say. Just imagine that you're God. We're going to be split apart into two halves as a country, and yet you're a loving God and want to kind of breathe into this images that tell you where we're headed, how we can go where we're headed. And so, ironically enough, there's two aspects of the question that all of these Oscar films ask. One is this idea of home, the idea of, will this concept of home kind of be saved, or can we do this for the sake of home? And the sake of home is in relationship to what I would say we. This concept of, will we be a we? Will we come together for the sake of our home? So you can't even think of a more applicable question for our times right now. Will we come together, this two-divided nation that we have right now, and become a we for the sake of our home?
Wow.
And that is actually the question that's being asked by every single one of these films. And I would start with just the concept of, let me just take the divided side of it. So in almost all of these films, you have two sides. Now, people could argue with me, well, most movies have two sides, or two lovers who are trying to get together, but it's not like this. So let's just take, for instance, Arrival. I'll start with that. I mean, you've got aliens.
Yes,
and
totally
you've got,
foreign.
right? And then you've got humanity who is sitting there going, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And there's two sides of even the we in that movie. There's the fact that they need a person who's a linguist to come together to figure out their common language between these two sides. I mean, that's what we need right now. We need a linguist to come in and say, how do these two sides talk to each other? And that's what we need as a nation right now. And here this film is depicting aliens and humans and them trying to figure out how do they talk to each other. One thinks this, the humans are thinking they're a weapon.
Right.
And the others, and, Amy Adams is trying to go, no, I think they're saying something else here. And then there's another aspect of we in this movie where halfway through the movies, the nations in the world stop talking to each other.
Yes.
And don't work as a we. And so you're not only dealing with the we of will aliens and humans kind of come together, but also will we as human beings come together and make sure we don't blow up the planet in the process of
right, like we're more in
this.
danger with the divisiveness and not being willing to work together than we are coming together and finding a we.
Exactly. Now that's just Arrival, okay?
Yeah, because I'm tracking with you because I'm thinking, in terms of Fences. Mm-hmm. If you think of Viola Davis's character, I mean, she has had a huge loss. Her family and what she has poured into is destroyed. I mean, kind of destroyed. I mean, with this extra child that's coming in, and how does she keep her family together, and how does she, make her son feel safe? I mean, there is that same thing of this we.
And if you think about it, Arrival was for the sake, like I said, each one of these is for the sake of home, right?
Yes.
So, Arrival is for the sake of our home, planet Earth, right?
Literally, planet Earth, yes.
Fences, literally for the sake of this home that we watch throughout the entire movie. Is this two sides? To me, the two sides, can be looked at in different ways in Fences. But to me, there is a literal two sides as far as he's birthed two different families in the film, with the illegitimate girl that he's birthed, and as well as his children that have to come together. And will they come together in the end? Especially Viola Davis being the one who has to decide whether she's going to be that child's mom. But there's also the two sides of this man, which, they
that are
refer
warring.
to.
He's warring against himself a lot.
Exactly. And at the end of the movie, it says you have to take the crooked and the straight side of this man. In other words, as we remember him in the end of the saga, we have to remember there is this side that was not pretty about him, and this side, which is the side that we remember that was glorious about him. And pulling those two sides come together for especially the son in the movie to be able to go, okay, I have a complete picture of my dad. That is the two sides that come together to me in the film also. And for me as America, it as far as our nation is concerned, it represents to me this crooked and straight side of America. Whenever Trump says make America great, there's just another group of people who goes, yeah, well, we're not so great with what we've done in the past or things like that. And so, there is a crooked side to America and there is a straight side to America. And we have to reconcile both of those pieces together in order to have a complete picture of who we are.
I love that. I love that whole piece of coming together. And that is, you're right. That is such a huge piece. If people can look at the crookeds and the straights and figure out, instead of just immediately saying, well, I don't like this side, so I'm just going to get rid of all of it, you miss the good.
Yeah. Now let's take Hidden Figures.
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty much easy to see, right?
Yeah.
You got two sides. You have these African-American women who are smart and brilliant scientists and mathematicians. And yet you have the white establishment, these men who are in control of NASA.
Will not drink coffee in the same coffee pot.
Exactly.
It's horrible.
Different bathrooms and stuff like that. Things that we know about Jim Crow kind of laws, during that time. And yet what we're rooting for is, will these two sides come together and ultimately for the sake of our home, right? Because this is the space race. It's, we need to get out there and put a man in orbit. It's for the sake of our home. And it's going to require these two sides to come together.
And a man's life. I mean, he had to,
Right.
John Glenn has to really
Glenn.
trust that they have done this math correct. And
Yeah.
if they don't call in and say, hey, I need you to double check, I mean, he's lost.
Exactly.
So there's death. There's like a death here. I mean,
Right.
this is imminent death.
Yeah. Hacksaw Ridge, same kind of concept as far as these two sides. So you have Andrew Garfield being the pacifist guy, and you're going, okay, there's one side, and of course they put him through all kinds of hazing and everything else, his battalion does, and just says, no, that side does not belong in war. The side that does belong in the war is the person who actually carries a gun. And yet what we wonder throughout the whole movie is, will these two sides actually come together and fight together side by side? And, as this plays out, your heart is, will they accept him? Will they allow him to do what he does best? And will they allow him to be a part, his ideology, to be a part side by side with their ideology? Think about that from a national perspective. We got two different ideologies right now, right? And yet this movie is showing two ideologies coming together. What is it for the sake of? It's for the sake of our home, because they're fighting for America in World War II.
Yeah.
So here again, another thing, for the sake of our home, two sides coming together. You look at, I'll just say real quickly, Moonlight and Lion. That's really dealing with two sides of a person, as well as there's sort of both of them have to do with two homes that these boys are coming of age in relationship to. So in Lion, you have the home of India where he's born and is a boy, and then he gets kind of lost from that and ends up in Australia in this different home. So he's got two homes, and your question throughout the whole movie and his kind of torment inside is, can I marry these two homes together, my birth home and my adoptive home, right? And so again, it's for the sake of home, but it's two sides of him and two sides of his identity that we're trying to see pieced together. So again, imagine America, we've got two identities right now, two ideas of what home is, right? And it's trying to figure out how we're going to bring those identities together. Same story almost exactly for Moonlight. Moonlight, he has this boy is being raised in a home where he doesn't have a dad, and he's got a mom who's on drugs, and yet he finds another home that he slips into in which this woman takes care of him, and this actually is a drug dealer, actually becomes almost a surrogate father for him as he's young. Then he grows up and he falls in love with another boy, and he's dealing with that. And then he grows up into a man, and there's, again, two sides of things. There's the two homes that he grew up in that he's trying to reconcile, and the idea of who he is, his identity is, because in his adulthood he's become the drug dealer now, and yet he's also being